Zooming in on music. Hello everybody, this is Michael Gieler again, viola player from the Concertgebouw Orchestra and artistic director of Music Stages. Today I have the privilege of talking to a very good friend of mine, the Australian composer Brett Dean. Welcome, Brett.
Thanks, Michael. Great to be here, wherever here is.
here in this strange space and strange time.
Yeah.
I've known
meeting room.
I've known Brett for a very long time. The first time we met, it was in 1989, just around the time when the Berlin Wall came down. Brett was then already a viola player in the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, and I was an academist of the Berlin Philharmonic. But at that point, neither of us, I don't think, had an idea that who would emerge from that friendly and optimistic and wonderful viola player and the Berlin Philharmonic. You have had quite a path since then, and if I may say, I don't think it has been a straightforward path in life. I mean, if you just look at the residencies you chose, you were born in Australia, you moved to Berlin, then you went back to Australia, you moved to Berlin again, then you moved to the UK, and now it seems like you have turned into a country gentleman, if I understand it right.
Yeah, well, I mean, my wife and I have certainly been itinerant, if nothing else, and we've always just gone with the flow. And yeah, we now find ourselves living in the countryside, about an hour's train ride from London to the west, in West Berkshire. And I mean, this is a kind of direct consequence of all that this year has thrown at us. So yeah, you talk about first meeting in '89, a remarkable time, and we find ourselves now in a remarkable time that we'll talk about for a long time, for many years to come. Yeah.
Yeah. And have you turned into a real English gentleman? So are you fox hunting and are you riding horses and playing golf?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, we do go on the hunt. No. No, but I do have a pair of wellies. You know, I've got my gum boots, which you really do need here to go on these lovely countryside walks. We've got a puppy dog, and we're sort of living the country life, certainly going walking a lot through these wonderful public footpaths and bridleways and so on. I mean, it is a magical place. It's verdant and delightful countryside, and you know, wonderful folk. And it was the antidote to you know, a kind of, I don't know, when everything sort of shut down and things came tumbling down as we know them, we needed a dramatic change. And so my wife, Heather, had the opportunity to take up, to spend lockdown with friends here in this area, in fact. And friends that we didn't know especially well. We're kind of distantly related tangentially through marriage, the marriage of our younger daughter. And so she took a bit of a punt on it, really. I mean, she wasn't really looking forward to being all on her own because I was stuck in Australia. I had the dreaded virus, and I was firstly in hospital and then recovering in Adelaide and then in Melbourne. So I wasn't quite sure when I'd be getting back to Europe anyway. And so Heather then ventured out here, shut the door on our tiny little flat in London, and yeah, we've basically been here ever since.
Wow, it sounds really idyllic, but it's also, in a way, it shows what a colorful and strange life you have been leading. I mean, you started off as a viola player in Australia. You have been very successful there. You won some prizes and stuff. And did you, at the time, did you have any idea that you would become a successful composer one day?
Not at all. I mean, on the contrary, I grew up, I guess, in a time where, even though I was fascinated by composition right from an early age, and I'd written, you know, a kind of string quartet as a teenager that I entered into a competition, and, you know, I dabbled in it. But I also, it was apparent to me there was this sort of tendency or attitude that composers compose and performers perform, and never the twain shall meet kind of thing. And, you know, we were in this kind of era in terms of composition and contemporary music of maximum specialization, I'd have to say. There was this kind of real schism or gulf between composing and performing. And so I don't know, I somehow subconsciously bought into that. And so I sort of put my dabblings aside and really concentrated then on the viola, which I was enjoying very much anyway. It wasn't as if I felt I was missing something.
And you were very successful doing so. I mean, not many people managed to get into the Berlin Phil.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, the funny thing about that as well is that it wasn't really my intention, and it wasn't necessarily even my goal. As I left from Australia, I was much more interested in playing chamber music, and I had a quartet in Brisbane before I left, before I graduated, and before I left to study in Berlin. I was going to Berlin to study with Wolfram Christ, and my ambitions, such as they were, and they were only sort of forming themselves then, they were much more driven by chamber music and quartet playing and so on. And that the idea had been that this quartet of friends would sort of follow me one by one, and we'd all meet up in Berlin and study together as a quartet. And one thing led to another, and that never happened. So by the time I was first of all invited to do some casual playing in the viola section of the orchestra, I thought, well, it's a very nice gig, and what an amazing sound that orchestra makes. I mean, you know, the first time I sat there, even though, I mean, you know, they were trying me out on a sort of not such prestigious concert. The orchestra in those days did, I think, 3 or 4 concerts with local choirs each season. So I was doing one of the Chorkonzerte, Dvorak's Stabat Mater.
Oh, beautiful piece.
Beautiful piece, yeah. Absolutely beautiful piece. And I mean, it sounded marvelous to sit in that viola section, even when it was kind of not one of the core repertoire pieces of the orchestra. But my goodness, what a gorgeous sound. But I remember also on that very first rehearsal, within, you know, 15, 20 minutes, I'd come crashing in on my own on a downbeat, because I had no idea just what the physics of that sort of slow response of particularly of the strings, you know, the way they sort of respond after the downbeat. And even more so in those days than they perhaps do now.
Yeah, it was the Karajan era, wasn't it? I mean,
that was this sense of
there was weight, you know, in the sound.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Weight in 2 senses of the word. Wait, don't play yet. And I was sitting next to the wonderful Siegbert Überscher, who you'll remember very fondly, and I couldn't have been next to a more sympathetic and delightful and just super person. Yeah. Siegbert was just the heart and soul of that viola section.
I think you're a better viola player than I am, because when I played next to Überscher for the first time, he turned around all the time and said, "Psst, nicht so laut." But I hope I have improved since I play in Concertgebouw Orchestra, but I don't think I was very subtle at the time.
Anyway, I remember sort of feeling mortified that I'd, you know, had my first unintentional solo, and I thought, oh, that's it. I'll probably never be asked back again. But he was just very kindly and sympathetic, and yeah, he kind of liked me, I think, or maybe he'd just been told by Wolfram to look after me because, you know, Wolfram, as the leader of the section, wanted to make sure I had a nice time, or at least a good experience. Anyway, I remember Siegbert just sort of, in the course of that first half of that rehearsal, even by the time of the first coffee break, it sort of said to me, look, just play with me as if we're two violas in a big string quintet. Just follow my body language. It's chamber music, really. And there's something about how he sort of, well, it calmed down my nerves for starters. And then it was really just a matter of feeling when and where and how to play with your desk partner, particularly when it's somebody as experienced as Siegbert. And so, you know, it was a bit of a baptism of fire in a way, but I guess for every string player or any player that goes into that orchestra for the first time, you're not going to be at your most relaxed.
You know what my first time was? It was that concert with Barenboim when the wall had come down.
Oh my!
That was my very first concert with you guys, and I was scared to death.
Unforgettable.
Wow! It was. At the time, I mean, I had only been playing the viola for about a year and a half, and I was mainly playing it, but not actually studying it.
You were a bassoonist before that, weren't you? Oh.
So I have never been so afraid in my life as at that point. It was just so scary. And I've never watched the video back. I hope that I'm not on it much. Well, in a way, I think the Berlin Phil, what you said about chamber music, I think that's very true and probably still true today. I haven't played with them for a long time, but this feeling that you do play chamber music together, I remember that people were so connected with one another when they played, and they were looking and exchanging glances across the. I now play in an orchestra which has a slightly different attitude. We also like playing together, but it's far less obvious.
Right.
And the Berlin Phil is very physical. It is
very physical.
Moving.
Yeah.
And but in a way,
it's kind of take no prisoners and heart on the sleeve all at once, that orchestra. Yeah. And I mean, I really took to it. I felt, you know, those first nervous moments notwithstanding, I felt very at home there in a relatively short time. Then when Wolfram suggested to me that I might prepare for an audition and go for the position that was vacant at the time, I kind of thought, well, look, you've got to be in it to win it. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, and all sorts of other cliches. But, you know, it's something I've obviously never regretted, because it was a marvelous sort of springboard into just this extraordinary world of, you know, where music in that city in particular is at the heart of the cultural fabric, you know, and then just being in amongst those great musicians over so many years. I was there 15 seasons ultimately. You know, I learnt an enormous amount. So yeah, it was very exciting.
But chamber music in another way, not in a string quartet, but in the Sharon ensemble, did continue to play an important part in your life, didn't it? And it also maybe somehow led to you starting arranging some pieces, and then maybe triggered some desire to create your own music, didn't it?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you say, I started then arranging pieces for the Sharon ensemble, which I should add is based around Schubert's octet, and it's still going. The Sharon ensemble is still very successful, one of the longest lasting the current, you know, sets of chamber groups within the orchestra. And what fascinated me about it particularly already back then, and this would have been then I started playing with them, I suppose, fairly early on after getting the position in the section, probably early 86 or so, I started playing with them. And what fascinated me was also that whilst they had this sort of stable main repertoire of, you know, classical greats such as the Schubert Octet and the Beethoven Septet and the Mozart Clarinet Quintet and all manner of things between, you know, 3 players and 10, but also contemporary music and an association with living composers was a major part of the ensemble right from the outset. And within the relatively short time that I played with them, I was there with them for 6 or 7 years, I suppose. You know, we worked together with people like Hans-Werner Henze and Isang Yun and all manner of wonderful musicians. Also, in the UK, we also worked with various conductors and composers, and Oliver Nussen, for example, comes to mind. And yeah, it was very, very exciting. We also worked with a lot of young composers and premiered, in many cases, you know, first larger scale pieces of some composers. And I guess it was through that experience too that I kind of thought, hang on a minute, I could have a crack at this myself. You know, I mean, I'd started doing the arrangements, as you mentioned, of mostly encore pieces, or occasionally sort of overture type pieces, because that's the area of repertoire that the octet didn't really have that much original material. And so I'd make a lot of encore arrangements, and the Fledermaus Overture of Strauss, and then Till Eulenspiegel by that other Strauss, and they were also very exciting experiences. And I remember something that a friend back in Brisbane had said to me before I'd even left for Berlin. Somebody who played in the Queensland Symphony and also enjoyed doing arrangements. And he said, just remember, when you do an arrangement, it becomes in some way your piece. You know, it's sort of like tinkering with an old radio, and you take it apart and you see how it works, and then you put it back together again. But in putting it back together, you leave something of your own personality and your own choices that you've made. And I really loved doing that. That, as you rightly recognized, that was the start of, you know, sort of wanting to, you know, there was ambition in those first outings.
And if I may say, I also find that the fact that you came from chamber music, that you came from playing in probably the greatest orchestra in the world, and you had all this experience with inside the fabric. I have the feeling that this also shows in your music. So this is a compliment. I've played quite a number of your pieces now, and I always feel like somebody is talking to me who knows what he is talking about, and that is not necessarily always the case with contemporary composers.
No, I mean, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And you're very correct that the years in the orchestra left an indelible stamp on particularly how I orchestrate and how I write for orchestra. There's something of that energy and physicality that is just, for me, that's orchestra, you know. And it also is because, not just because it makes a nice big sound, but because it actually engages the players in a really significant way. And I do find that it's then important to sort of gauge how difficult an individual string part, let's say, how difficult the viola part can be. And I find that the best results come when it gives the players something to really get their teeth into, and perhaps have to take the part home and practice it. But it's not so difficult that they're just left in its wake. Because if it's too difficult, particularly in the context of a professional orchestra where you have maximum 3 days to prepare a new piece or an entire program, if you can't somehow make inroads into it meaningfully in that time, then you won't get that sense of energy from the orchestra that is what you really need.
I think you're absolutely right. I think the only problem that happens occasionally, quite often I'm afraid, is that if composers write in a complex way and rightfully challenge the players, and then you don't hear the result because of instrumentation or because of being over ambitious, then that doesn't help. And so many orchestra players are quite rightly and quite in a justified way frustrated that maybe a composer writes incredibly complex and challenging figures, and they would love to practice that if they could be heard.
I mean, sometimes I was quite surprised when I, for example, had a week off in the orchestra, but they were playing a program I was interested in, and I'd go and hear it. And I was always particularly interested when it was newer music, although in the early years with Carry On and so on, that was less. It was just less frequent. It became more with Claudio Abbado and with Simon, of course. But it was also, even, to be honest, even in standard repertoire, sometimes kind of humbling to see how much you'd actually really even hear of even that viola section, even in that fantastic hall. So, it was a lesson in all sorts of ways in terms of balancing. And then if you're not really hearing text, is why? And one thing that I found always incredibly helpful and useful and taught me a lot was sitting in those seats in the Philharmonic that were right up near the roof, and you're sort of above the orchestra. There's a part called the Ehrenloge, the seats for the honoured elderly folk. But then there were these other, just a couple of rows of seats that were just under the ceiling, and they were sort of situated behind directly behind the first violin section and almost on top of them. And it was so fascinating to then see the orchestra from that angle and see how they operated, and also sort of take on board some of those aspects of who was playing what when, particularly when I sort of got more and more into writing my own music. That was very, very helpful.
Yeah. But then from being a successful viola player and starting composer, I mean, you had one of the most sought after jobs in the universe, and you still, at some point, you decided, well, I'm going to quit. Maybe it helped that you were a great performer and that you knew you would have concerts even if you weren't playing in the orchestra. But still, that shows quite a bit of courage. How did that feel at the time?
Well, I mean, look, I'd have to also, in all honesty, say that my wife Heather had a lot to do with that. She was, I think, of the two of us, she's the one that's taught me that kind of courage. And so she was incredibly supportive of that move, which, considering we had by that stage 2 young kids, and we were then sort of tossing in this incredibly, sort of secure and wonderful life. I mean, I didn't leave the orchestra because I didn't like it anymore. I was still having a ball and learning a lot. But it's not every marital partner who would sort of enter into that kind of happily and risk it all and say, come on, let's try it. But that's the kind of gal she is. And there was very, very much another aspect, even aside from my own compositional ambitions, which were quite significant by that stage, and I was really, you know, eager to sort of try it out. Cautious and nervous and all of that about leaving that security behind me, yes, but I was also, you know, ambitious. I wanted to try it. I wanted to know. I didn't want to die not knowing. But the other thing was that I could see, as marvelous as the job was, I could see already at the age of, I think, late 30s when I left the orchestra. I was about 38, 39 when I left Berlin and left the orchestra. But I could see already fairly accurately how my life would look for the next 25 years until retirement came along. And that sense of security and, above all, certainty, that I didn't like. I didn't like that idea that this was it and this was how, you know, good. All sorts of other things might have come along, and, you know, there would have been new conductors come along and new pieces and perhaps even some of my own pieces, who knows. But there would have been this kind of fairly, not predictable in the boring sense, but fairly, I could tell fairly clearly in 1999, when I actually left the orchestra, how life would look in, let's say, 2025, when I would have otherwise been in my final season. And
now
that,
we
that
wish
gave
we
me the
knew.
Sorry?
And now we wish we knew what 2025 is going to look like.
Yeah, now who knows what it's going to look like. So that's sort of throwing a spanner in all of our works. But yeah.
But I mean, that shows a lot of courage, and it shows that the creativity inside you just had to burst out, and burst out it did, for sure. We'll move fast forward now, because since then a lot has happened, and you've become one of the most appreciated composers in the world. You have written operas, you have written works for great orchestra, you write a lot of music. I mean, if people look at your catalog, it's more than impressive. And I don't know many people who manage to do that, while at the same time having a career as a performer, and also you do a bit of teaching, and I think you also been curating, and you have had some other posts. So how did you do all that? I mean, how is that possible?
Well, I think one of the things that is necessary if you do a lot of things, and I should say, you know, I enjoy doing those things because they cross-pollinate, and one feeds the other and feeds off the other. And, you know, so I think I couldn't imagine composing and not playing, and more recently also conducting, which I enjoy too. I don't do so much of that, but you know, the playing is still a big part of it, and I couldn't imagine one without the other now, playing or performing and composing. But it is important to sort of cordon off blocks of time, and especially if I'm writing a big work, it's then difficult to kind of have all of a sudden a kind of chamber concert or a conducting program or a, you know, a concerto to prepare in the midst of all that. And I must say, with the passing of time, I find that certainly doesn't get any easier, let's say. The bizarre thing about the year that we're in at the moment, and sort of having trouble, particularly here in Europe, extricating ourselves from the disaster of COVID, is that it's kind of it was interesting timing, let's say, that it sort of, I had to slam the brakes on like everybody else. Just everything fell away, all the engagements, all the flying around and going from this to this to this. And in catching my breath and getting off that carousel for a moment, it does look now rather dizzying. And I don't know that I will kind of want to jump on that speeding train at quite that speed now after this, you know, as things return to whatever the new normal might be. And I guess also one has to acknowledge, okay, I'm not that 35-year-old guy anymore. That's, you know, at that stage, you know, in the later years of being in the orchestra, I was then composing from whenever I got home from a concert at, let's say, at 11 in the evening till 2 in the morning, and then getting up early with the kids who by that stage were going to kindy or school. And, you know, that was, I couldn't do that at all now, I don't think. And, you know, I think I will probably, as things start slowly getting back to normal, I'll be a bit more circumspect about exactly how much I take on, and especially how much travel I do. And I'm pretty sure that it was having such a full diary that led me to be susceptible to getting the virus in the first place. For example, I was pretty sick, you know. It was not fun.
You were the first person that I heard of among my friends who got it. Actually, it was big news. Like, wow, Brett has corona, and you were in Taiwan, I believe, at the time. And it was so scary at the time. We didn't know what does it mean. And as you say, you were quite sick. So how?
Well, I wasn't diagnosed with it whilst in Taiwan. I did see a doctor, and I was feeling kind of, I was feeling not 100%. And in fact, some members of the orchestra there in Taipei asked through their management that I should see a doctor, because they were concerned themselves that I was coughing a bit in rehearsal and so on, which I said, you know, of course, I'll happily go and see a doctor. And either, you know, I really wasn't that sick at the time, or this doctor was asleep at the wheel, but he just diagnosed a mild bronchial complaint and sent me on my way. And so I saw out the concerts and I was playing my viola concerto and a chamber music program there in Taipei. And then I was flying on to Australia. And by the time I got to Adelaide, where I was to do some concerts with the Adelaide Symphony as part of the Adelaide Festival, by then I really didn't feel well. And I actually rang the orchestra and said, look, I don't think I should come in given the current circumstances. I think I should see a doctor and possibly also have a test. And I don't want to, you know, jeopardize the situation for anyone else. And sure enough, that's where the diagnosis came through. And yeah, it was pretty scary. And now in retrospect, it's sort of perhaps hard to say, it's impossible to say where I actually caught it, whether I caught it in Taiwan, whether I perhaps even had it before I left or caught it in transit, or whether it was really, you know, at the very end of the week in Taipei on the way to Australia. Who knows? I mean, you know, it's all academic, really. But I was pretty sick, and it's also hard to know whether it was COVID, that, you know, whether they were all COVID symptoms, or whether the fact that it was accompanied by a pretty hefty pneumonia, whether it was more pneumonia that I was dealing with probably. And the COVID symptoms, I was free of that relatively quickly after several days. I was then tested negative for the virus, but I was still pretty sick. So, yeah, anyway, it was a weird time. Don't want to go through that again.
I mean, you've also been a very successful opera composer. I mean, you wrote Bliss and you wrote Hamlet. So are you going to write an opera about COVID?
No. But the bizarre thing is, the piece that I was already working on and had just started work on it the very beginning of this year, in January, after the sort of Christmas, New Year celebrations, I started work on a project together again with the librettist of the Hamlet opera, Matthew Jocelyn. And we were working on a project which we subtitled An Evolution Cantata. In the meantime, it also has a title. It's called In This Brief Moment. And it's a piece that examines. I mean, we go for really small, humble projects like Hamlet, and and now in this instance, the sort of history of the planet and its evolution. And so we're looking at, all those billions of years of history in a sort of 45, 50-minute piece for double chorus and orchestra. So this is, in terms of COVID compliance, you won't be hearing this piece in a concert hall near you anytime soon. In fact, it's now being postponed for a second time, and at the earliest won't be premiered until February of 2022. But it was kind of bizarre to be writing a piece that in its libretto includes the words from Darwin that the strongest shall live and the weakest shall die, particularly as the extent, the reach of this pandemic was starting to unfold. I mean, that week that I was in hospital in Adelaide was the week that the world closed down for business. And so the Adelaide Festival still sort of soldiered on until the end of that week, and then life kind of basically stopped. And I was actually then driving to Melbourne and was lucky to get through before Fortress Australia sort of then closed down even all the internal state borders. So, the irony of working on this piece, which is still not finished. I mean, it's been slow going.
Well, you still have until 22, so plenty of time.
Yeah, I've got time. And goodness knows how I would have got there. Anyway. So that was kind of bizarre to be working with that kind of material, which, we kind of hit upon this idea in a way as a kind of reflection upon or a reaction to the sort of burgeoning sort of message of creationism and so on that's been coming from all corners, but particularly from the United States, of course, this kind of, I don't know, this flat earth sort of view of the world and its history.
I love jokes about the flat earthers.
Yeah, so, and yet, in the course of it, it has all sorts of other resonances and relevancies now that we can't have possibly foreseen. So it's not an opera, but it's as far as I'm going as far as the virus sort of story is concerned.
Let's look, or let's try to look at the future a little bit. So you have become a country gentleman, very refined with your shorts. You're on the golf course. Every now and then you write a bit of music. But no, quite seriously, what is life going to bring us? I'm doing this series because I'm like most people I know in the arts, for sure. I'm very insecure about what's going to happen. What's going to happen to our life, to what's going to happen to music, and that's why I actually started this series. So. Yeah. And so far, everybody seems to agree that we are in a time of transition.
Absolutely.
But where are we going to? What's your take on that?
Well, I must say, I feel also when you first mentioned the idea of this series of chats, talks, discussions, it was that sentiment that I found most, you're really genuine anyway, but that was what also I thought, well, that is a really good thing to do, because I think we do need to talk. We do need to look, long and hard at what's happened, what's going to happen. And I mean, I've always felt like I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And I want to remain positive. But I think, there are enormous challenges ahead. I think we're kind of naive if we don't acknowledge that. I know that, a lot of people with good reason have been sort of saying, this is a chance. This is a chance for us to kind of redefine how the world works, what our priorities are. And I'm absolutely, totally of that mind too. The difficulty is that, to then create genuinely functioning alternatives to how our society runs, we're doing it on the back foot financially. The financial havoc that this has wreaked already and will continue to influence. It can't be ignored, and our art form and the arts generally is, in many cases it functions best when other things are in order, and that there's kind of money available for what many people would term, the extras of life. We obviously don't see it quite like that, but in the hard world of budgetary discourse that's going to emerge out of all of this, I think we're in for some shocks.
But I'm not sure if that really is the problem. I mean, as it happens today, the Dow Jones index hit an all-time high. I mean, there are some companies like Amazon or tech companies, they made huge wins. I mean, it's unbelievable. The stock market is like exploding.
Going gangbusters.
Yeah. So money doesn't seem to be the problem, and all governments they're pumping money into the society just to keep things afloat.
Yeah.
But that's artificial, maybe.
Well, it is artificial insofar as, and here's where perhaps the most important restructuring of how we go from here on may be in making sure that the Amazons and Googles of this world are actually societal players, and that they actually pay the tax that they should, because often they don't. And
for sure, I mean, Holland made a business out of it. That's Dutch business case. We make sure that all these companies don't pay taxes.
Yeah, but then, so where does that lead us? Because yes, sure, there's money around, but you've got to then perhaps engage in a kind of, I don't know, US model where the arts is scarcely funded at a sort of public government level, and it's all through endowments and donations and benefactors. That's a cultural shift in itself, of course, and we also have to wait and see what's left in the US, because they've been hit especially hard, of course. And, some of the workers, I mean, talking now just within the sort of world of classical music, which is hardly on the highest agenda of problems to solve, but, focusing just on that, and it's our world after all, there are some of the worst stories have emerged from the US, exactly, with entire orchestras laid off and basically, cut free and fend for yourselves, ladies and gentlemen. And there was a bit of that in Australia too. The Melbourne Symphony was basically sort of sent home packing without even a cut lunch, and so.
But if there is plenty of money, and if there is plenty of musicians, so the problem must be somewhere else. The problem must be, maybe the problem is our public. Maybe how they're experiencing life today. Maybe orchestras are a thing of the past. Maybe opera houses are a thing of the past. I mean, I spoke, the first person I spoke in this series to was Ivan Fischer, and he's quite, well, I'd say, I mean, he's quite pessimistic in that sense. So he thinks that we have to rearrange, we have to rethink how orchestras work, and he thinks that our public is afraid, and I see it also happening. I mean, I'm running this concert series in Amsterdam, and obviously now we are shut down anyway. But even when you start concerts with less public in there, it's people are afraid, and quite justly, because I mean you've been through it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are these signs, particularly, I must say, from Australia and New Zealand, where, and it's in a different realm, sure, but, you know, just last week in Brisbane, there were 50,000 people at the final of this particular football competition, the so-called State of Origin between Queensland and New South Wales. And sure, it's in an open stadium, so it's not an enclosed space. But here is a society that, you know, at great cost as well to the economy, has shut down the place completely, and is, like New Zealand as well, has undergone a kind of elimination process of the virus. And it seems to have worked. And they're starting to open up, and they're able to be in great numbers, like at a sporting event just recently, and it doesn't become a super spreader. And if you then factor in two other things that do give me some optimism, and I watched some of your discussion with Ivan Fischer as well, and I absolutely know where he's coming from. I mean, I have my less optimistic moments as well, but certainly the news of the vaccines, plural, that are being, you know, sort of emerging from the labs is certainly has to be seen as a positive and some sort of key to a door to the way out of this. And the other thing that personally I found interesting is that after quite a lot of back and forth on this particular subject, ever since I took a significant personal interest myself, namely when I had the disease, and that is the question of immunity. It does seem that the newest findings seem to indicate that people that have had the virus do carry significant antibodies or T-cell rates that do offer some protection for potentially longer term. I mean, I'm no medical expert, and a part of the problem with all of this is that you've got, you know, politicians trying to be medical experts, and you've got medical experts trying to be politicians, and there's a situation of never the twain can meet. You know, as we've seen famously in Washington above all, but, you know, elsewhere as well, where, you know, the standoffs between the people giving the medical advice, the politicians either adopting it or not, the fact that also there's a lot of disagreement within the medical fraternity anyway about what the best way forward might be. I mean, it's, you know, there's hardly a kind of, there's not one way to look at this. It's readily apparent. But through all of this, you know, I do think that will be significant. If we can, we do, I couldn't agree more that we do have to be in a situation where people can confidently return to an enclosed space like a concert hall and sit amongst others, and potentially, you know, the old guy next to you that has the sniffle or the cough that you didn't think of twice only, you know, 12 months ago. That would give you pause for thought now at a concert. I know, I can absolutely understand that. And that is part of our challenge. At the same time, you know, whilst in the summer in Europe in particular, where, you know, I think the relaxation of the restrictions probably has made this winter all the harder. And you have had, you know, big outbreaks, and because people were spending time together and so on. At the end of the day, a classical concert isn't the sort of super spreader environment. You know, people are sitting mostly pretty quietly. They're not screaming out, well, you know, at a really, maybe, you know, at the end of a big symphony, they might call bravo and so on. But it's not like a mosh pit, is it? You know, it's not people sweatily dancing in each other's arms like in a club. And I don't know, one has to remain optimistic somehow, because I also, you know, we can also go down that path of maybe, you know, the classical concerts had its day and so on. I don't buy that. I really don't buy that. I think that's an easy way out for politicians and people who, you know, don't want to keep picking up the bill. I understand that too. It's an expensive art form and. But the end result of what it is that musicians spend, you know, so much of their lives perfecting is one of the great things that humankind has created, in my opinion. And sure, I'm biased. I earn my living from this very
You're totally
form,
objective.
I'm totally objective. But look, can you imagine living without it? And I know a lot of non-musicians that would find that an incredibly impoverished world too. It's not just because I'm a musician. I think it's it touches people in all sorts of unusual ways. And I think one of the losses in this year, and it's obviously also down the list of priorities of things that we've lost and can't get back. And it's obviously not high up on the tragedy stakes. But the loss of the celebration of Ludwig van Beethoven this year, I think for classical music as an art form, has been a great loss, because the celebration of his music in particular, perhaps more than just about any other, even of the great composers that I can think of, including Bach, I think there's something of the unifying humanitarian message behind so much of his music. You know, sort of difficult personality that he was, he reached out in a way that nobody had before him and very few have since. That the celebration of that, and in the process sort of shining the light on pieces of his that we don't know so well, but above all, that celebration of his humanist message and the fact that this is music that does unite people. I think that we missed out on something huge there in the course of this year, and you can't get it back in the same way. I mean, obviously his music will be played, you know, always in every season, and sometimes I'm sure in some ways also we would have had an overload of the Ode to Joy by the end of this year had it gone. You know, you would have played more than enough Beethoven nines for one year. Thank you very much. I'm sure that would be part of it too. But I think at the same time, you know, we've lost something very special that would have reached other audiences in the way that we often don't.
But maybe, I think you're saying something really important there, because we were talking about money, we were talking about people being afraid, about restrictions, and about politics and the great distrust in our society. But in the end, there is a unifying aspect in music like in nothing else that I know. And but maybe the challenge lies with us also, with the people that are creative, to think of more original ways to celebrate music than the 250th birthday or death of somebody. Maybe we can celebrate Beethoven in 2022 just because we can. Or maybe we can communicate in a different way. Maybe there are things we can learn from this from these strange times, how to reach out to people and how to unify them, with a goal, of course, of celebrating it together. I wish I knew the answers, but I think...
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right. And surely also this conversation that we're having now, and the whole, you know, abundance of things of this nature that have flourished through, you know, because we had no other means. And sure, we sort of went through this initial enthusiasm of Zoom concerts, and that waned fairly quickly, let's face it.
Oh, yeah.
It isn't.
So badly.
So that brings with it a couple of important points. One is that it reinforces just how special it is to hear music live and be in the room with people that are playing it and being part of that communion. But it is also, it has really helped, I think, many musicians and across other art forms as well to embrace the really great aspects of this communicative world in which we live, of IT and so on, and start doing some really interesting things with it. I mean, you know, you can now see concerts from, I mean, just the other night, I got a message that David Robertson, the American conductor, was doing a piece of mine with the Seattle Symphony, and had I been prepared to get up at 4 a.m, I could have watched it live from Seattle on my TV, you know, I mean, via the internet. And there's been this incredible initiative in Melbourne, the Melbourne Digital Concert Hall, which has been started by 2 young musicians in Melbourne, and has in the meantime raised something like 750,000 Australian dollars for Australian musicians whose livelihoods have been, you know, adversely impacted by all of this. It's given them work. It's reached this audience. And, you know, I think all sorts of things are happening that otherwise wouldn't have. And so I do see that there are ways. Not all of them will work. And maybe not all of these ensembles will survive. Yes, that's true. And I think we have to look at that hard and honestly and say, yeah, shit is going to hit the fan at some point for some aspects of our life, yes. But the ACO, the Australian Chamber Orchestra, released their programs for next year, incredibly full of energy and optimism, and they've launched it as a double season. They're doing concerts around Australia. Sure, they won't be touring internationally for a while yet, but they are also doing an online season. And that online season will reach people in places that, you know, they've never even played before. And, you know, so I think also I was speaking with wonderful viola colleague of ours, Lawrence Power.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How is he doing?
He's doing really well. And I mean, he's also an intriguing case in which Lawrence, first of all, commissioned composers to write pieces for him in this time, but he then in presenting them, he filmed them in very unusual places, and in the meantime has become really quite not only the entrepreneur, but this really it's this whole new creative world has opened for him, and he started his own production company. And so all of these commissioned pieces are in the empty Royal Festival Hall or on the beach at Aldeburgh, or, you know, and it has brought about this other creativity. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about, that we have to start finding other ways. And I think people are doing it.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good to hear that of Lawrence. I mean, I love his sound. It's incredible. I was lucky enough to play some chamber music with him.
His playing, yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, but he's also found this other aspect to his life that he wouldn't have perhaps stumbled upon otherwise.
Yeah.
So you know, there are silver linings to the cloud. Yeah. The cloud is awful. The cloud is awful, and it's maybe in a way. Lives, but
sorry.
No, go on.
Maybe in a way you weren't quite right when you said everything has to be well for music to flourish. Maybe we needed this crisis to reinvent ourselves and to reinvent our purpose in life. And of course, I don't know, and I'm searching for it. And I'm very grateful to people like you and others who join me in these conversations and share some information and share some insights maybe. Because I don't have the illusion that we'll find the Holy Grail, but at least we are on the way.
No, but I remember somebody once telling me that the translation in Chinese of the word crisis, and I'm not sure, I've never looked it up and I don't speak Chinese, so it may be bullshit, but the translation of crisis in Chinese equates to or adds up to danger plus opportunity. And even if that's not true, and it's apocryphal,
it's certainly a good story.
It's a great thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
And another Chinese, well, maybe Chinese proverb, but anyway, proverb is that the darkest point of the night is just before dawn breaks. So on those more optimistic notes,
yeah, let's keep going, let's keep inventing. And I'm so grateful to be able to speak to you about these things and keep inspiring us and keep writing great music. And I sincerely hope that I'll see you back here in Amsterdam or wherever possible in not too distant a future. Thanks, Brad.
I hope that too, Michael, and you keep going as well. It's wonderful. I think it's a terrific thing to do, and can't wait to give you a hug. Social distance be damned. I want to give you a hug.
Damn you, Corona. We are coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Take good care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Zooming in on music.